table of Hampshire College astronomer Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe, who is also a board member of Amherst Cinema. Amherst Cinema is going to join us Friday to do a little bit of an Oscar wrap before the Oscars this weekend. And we are going to talk about a big movie that opened this weekend based on a book. But your favorite book of all time is...
The Great Gatsby.
And we're going to talk about The Great Gatsby and the potential person who was the real inspiration behind Gatsby with this person's granddaughter later in the show today. But the book and the movie we're talking about right now is...
my favorite science fiction book.
Yes.
That is Dune.
Dune Part 2 was opened in theaters this past weekend. We both saw it.
Okay, so the first impressions, because we can actually talk for hours.
Yes.
And days.
I'm a huge Dune fan. I've read all of the Frank Herbert books of Dune and some of his son's books too, which then I stall out after a little while when that happens, but yeah.
You're a better person than me, Monte, because I stopped after the second one. But I think, but of course, Dune is good. So just first impressions before, and you can just give us a little bit of a summary of what the movie is about, but we watched it, not at Amherst Cinema. Sorry about that. And that's because it wasn't playing there. And, so we watched it on XD, the biggest screen. And it was just mind-blowing. It was an amazing experience. And again, if you think about what movies should be, if they transport you out to a completely different imaginary world, this is what it is. And with a gripping story, and I love the first one as well. So now you have 6 hours or 5.5 hours of absolutely fantastic cinematic experience.
It looks gorgeous. And the highest compliment I can give it is that at one point when I was watching the movie, I felt like, this reminds me of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And I was like, I don't know if I should publicly admit this, because that's such an epic and wonderful movie. But that was the feeling I got for even a couple brief glimpses during Dune.
So it is directed by Denis Villeneuve, and he came from an indie circuit. One of his films, if you are interested in it, in some ways it's a little timely, but Incendies, that was a French-Canadian production, which was about, sort of like based on, loosely, on Lebanese civil war in the 1970s. It doesn't say which country it is based upon. And so that was a small film that really focused on blood relations, bloodlines. And when I watched it many years ago, I think it won the best foreign film Oscar for that. I was like, that's really interesting. And then he went on to make other films which were really good, Enemies, and then, of course, science fiction film Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. So he has slowly moved on to these films, but I think with Dune, he has really found I shouldn't say found his groove, because he had his groove, but I think he has really taken it to the next level. And I was listening to his interview in which he said that he read the novel Dune, which I'm holding it in my hand, by the way, when he was 13 or 14. And he and his best friend, who also read it, apparently they wanted to imagine it. They wanted to have a movie like that, and so they created sort of like drawings based upon what it would look like if you have a movie about that. And then he watched the David Lynch version that came out in the mid-'80s, and which has Sting in it.
Yeah.
The
artist.
The artist.
As Fade Rafa.
And
Kyle MacLachlan.
That is true.
I love David Lynch. I love Kyle MacLachlan. Even David Lynch hates David Lynch's Dune.
That is true as well.
He says it's a cautionary tale as to why you should always have final cut as a director, and he never would ever not have final cut ever again after that moment.
And it also is a cautionary tale that there are some stories for which you have to wait for good special effects.
That's right.
I think you are limited by that. But Denis Villeneuve, so he loved Dune so much. He actually loved the David Lynch version, but he was like, he has made some choices which... I don't know. I wouldn't have made it because it is a little weird film, because it is a David Lynch film.
There are some awesome things about David Lynch's Dune that are not in this new version of Dune that I kind of wish were. Some of the magical spice, space travel, things like that, those don't really show up in these movies.
So Denis Villeneuve got a chance, actually, to make this movie by himself, which I think is an amazing story for all the 13 and 14-year-olds out there. dream big.
Yeah.
Just think about it. Like, I mean, and that is such a fantastic age if you do something, if you get passionate about it. And and that's a power of books also. I know you're going to talk about The Great Gatsby and others, but it's a power of books that, that it can transport you to another world, whether in the past, whether it's fictional or whether it's on another planet.
When I listened to the audiobooks of Dune, so I would be driving back and forth to work in my car, and I felt like my car was Arrakis. And they transported me like I lived on a desert planet. And whenever I went to my car, I felt like I put a still suit on and recirculate my water. And this movie transports you too. You feel like you're living in the desert with them, especially if you see it on such a grand scale in a theater as it's meant to have been seen.
And it is beautifully shot. He used natural light. So in the scenes in the desert,
filming in the middle of at the most odd hours, making the cast for a half an hour shoot of perfect light to try to get the perfect shot.
The sunrises and sunsets, and so this is shot in Jordan, where a lot of these, like The Martian and a lot of other science fiction films are, in Abu Dhabi and Namibia and other places. But the story is set about in 10,000, around the year 10,000, and this is in another sort of star system where there are different houses that are fighting for power. And one of the planets, whose name is Arrakis, that is at the center of it because that is the planet which contains what is called spice or melange. And this spice is crucial for the Empire because it allows space travel, it allows for foreseeing things and sort of parapsychic phenomena and things like that. And why it is crucial and is because there are no computers at that time. Computers had been eliminated. So this is an aside. And in the book, it mentions sort of that there was this Butlerian jihad where the machines fought against humans, and then humans were like, okay, well, maybe we should not make them. And so they outlawed computers. But then how do you travel in space and how do you make calculations? And one of the ways you do that is through the use of this spice.
It feels like a mix of sci-fi and mythology/religion. Like there's not a lot of science in Dune in the traditional sci-fi sense. So does this, Star Wars, I often argue, is space fantasy. It's space western. It's not science fiction. Star Trek is science fiction. There's science in there. They're talking about concepts of science. Where does Dune, the book and or the movies, fall for you as a scientist? Does this feel like science fiction to you?
Yes, but it does have a lot of mysticism in it. Mm-hmm. And so there are two things I would say regarding that. One is, I mean, of course, it is a critique of colonialism because it's the people of Arrakis who are being exploited in some ways by these different houses. And then they are the ones who band together against the houses. And
with the help of a white savior, which is a little problematic.
Yes, except that Frank Herbert wanted to critique the white savior aspect of it. But as he said himself, but people fell in love with the protagonist in the first book, whereas it was supposed to have been an anti-hero. And what he wrote about that was something that that you have to. It began with a concept. This is Frank Herbert talking about his novel. He says it began with a concept to do a long novel about messianic convulsions which periodically inflict themselves on human societies. And he says I had this idea that superheroes were disastrous for humans. Because of these heroes, much better, beware of these heroes, because it is much better to rely on your own judgment and your own mistakes. But at the end of the book, which when I read it, I was also I also loved the character of Paul Atreides because there was a lot of Arabic in there too, and there is a history to that, and we're going to talk about it in 1 second. But the ending was I was like, wait a minute, he goes back. Sorry about the spoilers, but I guess I'm talking about the book.
Yeah. Although this movie ends where the first book ends.
That's right. So there are issues with that. So I'm not going to give away the ending, but there was well, that's a little weird. It makes me uncomfortable. The movie, Denis Villeneuve, knew about this critique of that. And he has made the main character a lot more an anti-hero, more clearly an anti-hero than the book does. And I think that is a good change because Frank Herbert wanted to write the second book, the Dune Messiah, in order to clear up this white savior confusion about it. He was like, no, I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah, bad things happen in Dune Messiah, and if they make the third movie, I think we're going to see something.
Which he is planning on making, because he thinks that it is that movie has to be made because that finish ups at the arc, because otherwise it's an unfinished story. So that aspect is there. There are still issues with that because the casting, I mean, it's in the Middle East. And again, that was another interesting element to it, that Frank Herbert wanted to introduce a lot of the language that is there, the ones that the Fremens, these are the people of Arrakis, the language they speak. And he created that language, but that was a mixture of Navajo, Aztec, Hebrew, Arabic, Persian, and so on and so forth. But a lot of it Arabic. And in fact, the main character, Paul Atreides, he takes the name of Muad'Dib, which is a desert mouse, or somebody who leads the way. And in his interviews, Frank Herbert said he deliberately did that because in the 1970s, he said that he thought that people actually in the West don't read much about Islam, and he thought that people should. And so he introduced these aspects of Islamic religion as well. I mean, there are other aspects as well within that story, and within the Fremens, who are in some ways the more sympathetic characters to the story. And unfortunately, the language that is used now in the film, which was created by a language expert who creates actually these constructed languages, the short form is Conlang, and he created it, and he really believes in sort of like the logical consistency of languages, and he was hired to do Dothraki in the Game of Thrones, and now he gets hired by he was out of job, by the way, but now he gets hired by all the Hollywood whenever they want to create a language like Avatar or others, and things like that, they hire him. But so was for Dune, and he wants to maintain the logic of it. So if there are certain words in it, he actually gets very annoyed by it. He was annoyed by apparently George R.R. Martin as well, because he was like, but that doesn't, the word that was used in the book doesn't make it consistent to the language that he is inventing. And so I think partly, unfortunately, I think a lot of the Arabic got washed away in the language that they are speaking in the movie. Nevertheless, it's a fascinating thing that you can actually create a language. So talking about science, I mean, so here is linguistics coming in, those rules are applying, and they had dialect coaches for that, and they were really trying to make sure that when the characters are speaking the Fremen, they are actually speaking it the right way to make it believable.
It's an incredible movie from a cinematic scope. It is very well acted. There's plenty of action. And it is a critique, as you mentioned, on colonialism and the dangers of ascribing to a belief in a messianic figure. It has been compared to Empire Strikes Back. It's worth noting, there would be no Star Wars if it were not for Dune. That David Lynch's Dune, the movie from the 80s, has some wonderful things. Watch the documentary Jodorowsky's Dune about this maniacal filmmaker who I have a lot of critique about for other reasons, how he wanted to put that movie together, and the book of the art that he created to try to make his movie, which would have starred Mick Jagger and Salvador Dali, amongst others, was really kind of the template for Star Wars. So if you love Star Wars but have not seen Dune, you are doing yourself a disservice.
Yes, and I should also mention, and that's a key thing to remember, because you would watch Star Wars and you go like, wait a minute, did Dune rip off Star Wars? Actually, no, it's the other way around, because the novel came out in 1965. But the root of this novel, I mean, there are so many ways that you can think about it, and you asked about the science fiction aspect of it. Frank Herbert started off as a journalist, and he was writing an article, he was asked to write an article about sand dunes in the Northwest, actually in Oregon. And there was a problem because the dunes were shifting. And so how do you make them not shift, because they were caught destruction? So he actually wrote that article in which they were planting these grasses, which were called European grasses. So again, so the problem is, as you can see, there's an invasive species and so on and so forth. So the genesis of this planet ecology comes from his own work, his own reporting on the issue of dunes and how the solutions were brought in sometimes and or oftentimes to the detriment of the environment, and often ignoring the indigenous knowledge, because he actually had contacts with indigenous groups over there, and those sort of like that knowledge was not being incorporated, and they were the US government was actually going through with that. These are all going into, if you read a novel Dune or you watch these things, in the ecology of the planet Arrakis. And they, in fact, in order to hold this, they actually use grasses in the same way as they were using in Oregon. And he's concerned about, in the novel, taking the whole planet as an ecosystem. Like, that you cannot just do one thing and another and it doesn't impact on the other. And again, that is a concept that became later on known as, it's controversial also, like Gaia, that the whole Earth is sort of like, is determined through life, or life interacts with that. And so those are the type of things that he's bringing in. And just one little aside, when he was in the Northwest, you would see whales. And here, he had worms. So, I think there are these elements that he is looking at, which actually made it into the novel.
Go see it in theaters before it leaves. You won't. It's wonderful.
This is a movie for theaters, and this is what the cinema is about. So go see movies. Oscars are next week as well. Go watch those movies as well. But this is a phenomenal experience.